problem we're going to be talking about today is housing insecurity, which is, I think, particularly poignant for Atlanta, as I know some of Taylor's work shows. So we've got 5 faculty today: Melody Kelley from chemistry, Dan Pasciuti from sociology, Fei Li from urban studies, Jason Flato from philosophy, and Taylor Shelton from geography. So a lot of different angles here on the issue. Just a second on wicked problems. So this comes from planning discussions in the 70s, 1970s, and just talking about issues that were pretty much impossible to solve. Issues that we face as a society that if you were going to solve these issues, you're going to resolve them over and over again because it's constantly changing. It's also hard to even wrap your mind around the problem. So the importance of different disciplines, different angles of looking into this, different communities talking about these issues to try to figure them out. And once again, not really with the hopes of fully understanding it or fully coming up with, here's the solution, but rather there are many solutions. There's many ways to understand these things, and these things affect us all. The other issue that we're having these events around is climate change, and we have another event at 4 today. So it's become kind of buzzword language for higher ed. Our students need to be working on wicked problems. The idea is, traditionally, we've had, okay, I'm going to talk at you, and then you're going to repeat what I say, right, as students learning something. And that's not really what we should be doing. Instead, it's how do we struggle with issues. And so these ideas of wicked problems are a good way to do that, because I can't, and no one up here can tell you, here's the answer, right? Or here's exactly how to understand this. You could read 100 books and you would not fully understand it, right? All the angles. So that's what we're going to do, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it to Melody Kelley. Do you want to walk around and I can click? Do you want me to click, or do you want?
I'm
Okay.
gonna click and walk and
Okay.
all that stuff. Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. All right. So I'm Melody Kelley. I will be discussing housing insecurity through the lens of an organic chemist. Any organic chemists in the room? Okay, just wanted to check. So that being said, a key component of housing insecurity is the affordability part of it. And I know you're thinking, oh, what does that have to do with chemistry? I'm going to connect it. You just bear with me. When it comes to sort of the future and creating more places for people to live, the path forward is going to be committing to more dense concepts. All right, so we're going to have to put more people into smaller places. So we refer to that as density. Now, let me just say that compared to other similarly sized metropolitan areas, Atlanta is one of the least dense cities in our country. So compared to something like New York or Houston, in fact, I think we are number 316 of the most densely populated cities in the United States. And so a key type of housing product that's being developed are, and I think we all know, apartments. So my angle on this is going to be looking at affordability and multifamily housing stock because it is becoming more and more prevalent in new development. Here's another fact, and I think you all know, but most of Atlanta rents. So when you look at the population of Metro Atlanta, I'm looking at, we have 3 graphs here. We have a city average, we have Georgia statewide, and we have Atlanta citywide. The blue bar, if you can't see, the blue bar represents the percentage of occupied housing total, and the red bar represents owner occupied, and the yellow bar represents vacant housing. So if we focus here on Atlanta, you can kind of see that the percentage of owner occupied housing in Atlanta is below 50%. So what that tells you is more than 50% of the population of Atlanta rents their homes. They're living in renter occupied housing. But here's the thing. Renting and density in apartments doesn't necessarily equal affordability. So almost half of the people who rent in Metro Atlanta are spending more than 30% of their income on rent. So what does that mean? That means that communities have to become smarter about preserving what's referred to as naturally occurring affordable housing stock. Naturally occurring affordable housing, basically older apartments. Now that's where the chemist comes in, right? So when we talk about maintaining affordable housing stock, older apartment communities, right? You go to a neighborhood, you see some new apartment building being built. 20 years from now, that's going to be very important affordable housing stock. So how can we preserve the quality of that type of housing product? One way is by paying attention to air quality, all right? So as a chemist, the way I would submit that we could look at this issue, the housing issue, naturally occurring affordable housing stock, is by looking at indoor air quality. And so when you talk about indoor pollutants, first of all, why am I talking about indoor at all? Because studies have shown that we spend over 90% of our lives indoors. So indoor air quality is actually quite important, and there's a class of pollutants known as volatile organic chemicals, all right? And within that class of chemicals, you have combustion products, so think about things you burn in the house. You have pesticides, which is where I'm gonna focus. So we're gonna talk about pesticides and indoor air quality for just a second. Let me tell you this. According to the EPA, there are no regulations as it relates to indoor air quality and volatile organic chemicals, specifically pesticides. There's no requirement, there's no guidelines. Even though studies have shown that there's a ton of health effects if you accumulate too many pesticides or volatile organic chemicals in the home. So just imagine it. You have a property that's full of small apartments. You have pest control treatment. The renter very often has no control over what chemicals are sprayed, over what company is used, and very often, depending on the quality of the housing, you might have someone coming to visit weekly, spraying chemicals. So you can imagine there's an accumulation of volatile organic substances or pesticides being built up in older apartment communities. Here's just a handful of common pesticides. There was a study done, I want to say 2008 or sometime early 2000s, that showed that this compound on the upper left, cyfluthrin here, it showed an accumulation of cyfluthrin in multifamily housing that, and there was a correlation between the concentration of cyfluthrin and people of Hispanic descent. So there was actually a sort of an ethnic, racial overlay in that particular study. And it's also, speaking of cyfluthrin, is actually a restricted compound that is only reserved for agricultural uses. So cyfluthrin should never be found in a home. So we're talking about a situation where someone's home is being treated with probably a pretty cheap pesticide that is actually restricted, but because there are no guidelines and there's no way to assess, you potentially have people who are being impacted in terms of their nervous system, their respiratory system, and even asthma. So as an organic chemist, and as a person who teaches organic chemistry in the organic chemistry classroom, there's a lot that could be done. This is a huge area that could be explored. So more laboratory type work would be direct sampling and analysis of air, dust, and surface samples using gas chromatography, which is a common technique in sophomore level organic chemistry courses. Lecture courses can explore pesticide neurotoxicity. We could also talk about decontamination chemistry. So if you are in a situation where there's a concentration of some of those chemicals I showed on the previous slide, there's actually chemistry you can do to disinfect the home. And so that's a whole different conversation as well as outreach campaigns like this so that people know and can be a little bit more mindful about that. Thank you. Sorry. Yep, no problem.
Let's see. Dan. Oh, y'all are in order.
Yep, we sat in order. See this, thank you. All right, good afternoon. My name is Dan Pasciuti. I'm in the Sociology department. So thank you all for coming today and joining us for this conversation. So sociology is sort of long sought to address issues of the housing question. Frederick Engels made famous the usage of the term the housing question in 1872 on a series of articles talking about how to try and address housing insecurity in Europe and challenge the idea that, that a solution to housing insecurity was some singular policy or program prescription. And about 100 years later, John Panus and Chester Hartman wrote in 1973 that when households consume housing, they purchase or rent more than the dwelling unit and its characteristics. They are also concerned with such diverse factors as health, security, privacy, neighborhood and social relations, status, community facilities and services, access to jobs, control over the environment. So being ill-housed, right, can mean deprivation along a series of issues. And so this is just a meme that I quite like. It's the relation of 13th century social media to 21st century social media. And, you know, Venn diagram overlap. My landlord is cruel, I dislike the new king, and I fear I will die in my hovel this winter. So, so sociology seeks to address these sorts of questions in a number of different ways. They are central to the narrative of variation in social inequality, and the consequences of housing inequality and insecurity spill over into a myriad of other indicators of social and economic well-being: education, employment, health outcomes, even the ability to resolve criminal charges or access the legal system. So up here, this is actually some work that was done for the Center for Access to Justice here at the GSU Law School. And this is a map of Georgia by the prevalence of lawyers. And which I hope what you can maybe see sort of here on the left is that there are whole areas of Georgia where there are no lawyers present. They don't exist. You do not have any practicing lawyers in these counties. So the ability to even ask questions or get representation in this regard becomes a question of who is there? Is there even the ability to access that? And when we think about it in the context of housing, we can talk about the idea of eviction, of housing dispossession, and the ability to seek a lawyer to even ask for help may not exist in the county where you are being evicted, where you're being dispossessed of your housing. So in this context, right, the practice of eviction varies across these legal jurisdictions. And one of the questions we can ask is, how do the policies and practices of legal jurisdictions impact questions of housing security? So for example, in the context of eviction, there is one law in Georgia that governs eviction in the state, but that law is incredibly vague. It basically says the case has to be processed in a reasonable amount of time, but there's no definition of what reasonable is, and that any fees or services or other costs associated with that from your landlord cannot be punitive. But again, punitive is not defined. And so courts can actually choose and interpret these policies in very different ways. Some courts will say that, you know, processing and quickly on time means that a court case has to be done within a couple of weeks. But there's not actually a defined time to that. Some courts will allow that if your landlord has written in your lease agreement a certain amount of late fees or extra fees tacked on, that is acceptable and will be added in the court case. Other courts in the state have actually determined that anything above $50 would be actually punitive. And so regardless of what's in your lease, they may make the decision that $50 is the maximum that can be applied in a case. But it varies, and it varies greatly. So the presence of lawyers, court policy procedures, even the type of law enforcement that you would engage in this aspect may differ. Some courts in Fulton County, you're going to deal with the sheriff's department. In other counties, you may deal with constables or other forms of law enforcement that are different. They have different relationships to the courts. So eviction and housing insecurity as a measure we know is quite prevalent throughout Georgia. This uses data from the eviction lab. And Fulton County, we have lots of eviction filings and eviction issues in here, but it travels all across the state. And that plays out in a number of consequences about how we think the role of housing insecurity affects that. And so an example of this is a project I did last year. We were looking at who was seeking aid for eviction this is in Clayton County. And one of the things we simply asked was, do you have kids? And if you have kids, where do they go to school? And we were simply looking at how is this affecting education? And you can think about, obviously, the individual effect of being evicted and how having to, your family move homes may affect you in the classroom. But it actually has a really interesting implication on the educational system itself. If schools face large numbers of children moving during the course of an academic year, think of as a teacher, if you have large number of students moving into your classroom or out of your classroom randomly throughout the course of the semester, your ability to stay on track, your ability to keep a schedule and teach subjects becomes very limited, right? So again, these implications into education as a practice. So again, to understand these issues requires an understanding across a variety of fields to address legal, political, policy, educational, and other types of issues. The specific example I wanted to sort of present to you today was a project actually from a couple of years ago at the start of COVID. And at the start of COVID, right, we understood that it was a medical emergency, but there was also a very clear connection of the need to keep people housed at the start of COVID. And so a series of policies and procedures were brought down, both from the federal government and the state government, about what that should look like. There was a federal eviction moratorium for a period of time. That was then followed by the CDC moratorium that lasted for a period of time. The state of Georgia had its own policies put out by the Georgia Supreme Court. And so what we did is we actually surveyed courts all across Georgia at different time points throughout this period to understand what they were doing in response to these policies and what was going on. So we looked in May of 2020, November of 2020, July of 2021, and then we actually looked a little bit at the end after the Supreme Court knocked down the CDC moratorium. In August of that year, we sort of continued to follow along to see what courts were doing. And very quickly, it became very clear that courts were doing all sorts of different things. Some courts closed, would not accept cases. Some courts would accept cases, but they would only accept them online. You couldn't come in and hand in a paperwork, or the court itself wasn't physically open. But other courts were only physically open. That was the only way you could approach the court. They would not accept online filings. And so this variation played out in very interesting ways. But what was interesting is that we found no correlation to the decisions that the courts made to any other social demographic variable. There was no correlation to anything. It didn't correlate to urban-rural space. It didn't correlate to politics. It didn't correlate to any sort of demographic issue. It seemed to be completely random. One of the specific examples is the CDC declaration form. So when the CDC moratorium was put into effect, the CDC put out a form that you had to fill out to say, I am potentially facing housing insecurity. I need protection from this. How do you find out that information? How do you know that that is a form you have to fill out? And so one of the questions simply became, does the court tell you? And 61% of courts in Georgia would not tell you that answer. They say it was a form of legal advice, and you cannot give legal advice if you're a court. So, but it was an interesting dynamic of who thought it was legal advice and who did not think it was legal advice. So, Fulton, Fulton, DeKalb, Cobb, Clayton, they would tell you that this form exists. Gwinnett, Rockdale, other counties would not tell you this. And so real quickly, so I'm definitely over time at this point, there were lots of different methods that engaged in this, that courts engaged. And we found significant differences in how courts accepted cases, how they dispensed information, and how they adapted to federal and state orders. This meant that where you lived, what county court you were assigned to, had an important impact on the outcome of your eviction case, on your ability to stay housed during this crisis. In some places, the case was on hold. In others, the case was processed and the burden of eviction was delegated to the local law enforcement agency. And in others, the courts were simply closed and you couldn't even file a case. So this meant that the level of formal housing insecurity a person or household faced during this period depended greatly on the individual choices of particular magistrate judges, regardless of federal and state pronouncements. All right, thank you.
That's for me if I can keep the time limit. Right. Do we have a clicker? No?
I do not.
So just, okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fei Li from Urban Studies Institute. So I guess to give a brief intro about urban studies and why housing is an urban problem. So urban studies itself is a very interdisciplinary field of studies. We do borrow and use the methodologies, perspectives, and theories from a number of disciplines, including a lot that would be talked about here. So housing is one of the key questions we are trying to address within urban studies through also these related disciplines perspectives. So say when you approach the housing in urban studies, you have questions related to urban planning, policy, public administration, urban economics, including urban sociology and geography, and governance, political science, and so on and so forth. And also some physical sciences such as environmental science and chemistry related to housing quality and housing services. So why is housing such a urban problem so central in urban studies? Well, one thing we do know is currently most of the world population live in urban areas. So this has been a thing much earlier for developing countries such as North America and Western Europe, but for a lot of other parts of the world that are currently still developing urbanization, which means the process of people moving to urban areas or previously rural areas becoming urban areas is still very much an ongoing process. But still, I guess officially about a decade ago, the world has become more urban than rural. Depending on how we define urban, that's debatable, but we know it's rapidly increasing the amount of people living in urban areas. So this increasing population, with economic and population growth in cities need to expand and they need to provide more housing for the incoming migrants. And that often becomes a problem and lead to affordability challenges and housing shortage and of course housing insecurity. So one of the inherent challenges that we see in conflict in urban studies or in the city is this conflict between land and housing being seen as a commodity, an investment, a form of speculation versus housing as one of the basic human rights that we just need to provide to the people. So if you're familiar with the term the right to the city, so this in the original writing of the French author Lefebvre, he did mention that to inhabit was this basic right that cities and towns provide to its people. So being able to live in the city is the premise before you can do anything about the city and community. And to think of it, the character of a city depends on who can live there, right? So being able to live there and not being excluded from the city is the first thing we have to guarantee before we can allow people the right to contribute to community affairs, to participate in governance, and so on. So here are some numbers reflecting current state of housing insecurity in Atlanta and Georgia. So one of these are, Dr. Kelley already mentioned, numbers a little different but very similar. close to 50% of renters in Metro Atlanta are rent burdened, which is considered like paying 30% or more of your pre-tax income on housing. And housing price appreciation, next one, over 60%. This is how much more expensive that homes have become since we were in the previous peak before the Great Recession in 2007. So now we are already facing a lot higher housing costs even compared to back then. The accumulated eviction fighting rate, fighting rate, it looks absurd that to consider like 65 evictions have been filed for every 100 rental units, but this is accumulated, meaning multiple cases could have been filed for the same unit. So it's not like 65% of the families or renters being evicted. But still, this is pretty shocking, but this is since 2020, like the beginning, April 2020, the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and we didn't know that evictions have been on the rise since then. And the last number, 53 of every 100,000 people in Atlanta are homeless, and this is considered a relatively low number compared to other major American metros. So now if you think back to this conflict between the use value and the strategic value, basically meaning housing as a commodity versus housing as a right. So there are a number of policy programs, from urban policy, which is more related to my own research, how we can address this problem, how we can make housing more affordable. So basically, despite that, we have a number of policy instruments. Think of public housing, rent control, housing vouchers, and so on and so forth. In most countries or cities around the world, housing is still more or less treated in the market as a commodity. So another thing is with urbanization, especially with a lot of urban renewal or revitalization projects, think of Beltline as example in Atlanta, you are going to see is rapid increase of housing values, of course, and with rents in affected areas because now you have better services for these housing. Now, like Dr. Pasciuti said, when you purchase housing, you purchase more than just the building itself, but also like the accessibility, the neighborhood, what you can get by living in that area, right? So when it becomes more desirable to live in a certain location, housing costs increase. Now, what can we do to prevent these changes, neighborhood change or gentrification, so to speak, from displacing the poorer residents and still provide low-income, moderate-income people a chance to live in these areas is by one of these land value capture strategies. And me personally, I'm more interested in the last one, inclusive zoning, which is a method by requiring the developers who built in the area to provide a percentage of their newly built units as affordable housing. So Atlanta does have its own inclusive zoning program, and this is a map I think I just got out from the City of Atlanta website, and you can see a report there reporting since adoption of this program, I think since 2018. And a list of projects that have been built with a inclusive zoning permit and how many units have been provided or how many units are in the pipeline. So it initially started with just the zone around Beltline, right? Considering Beltline is one of the major projects in Atlanta that might cause gentrification and housing price appreciation. And later, two more, you see the pink and orange zones on the left was associated to the projects on the west side Park. So the issue when you look at these American programs of inclusive zoning versus inclusive zoning used in other parts of the world is the scale that they apply to and the requirement for affordable housing, like how affordable they have to be. Because when you look further into this broad term, affordable housing, like affordable for whom? You're affordable to people who are just kind of
moderate income or very low income. So there is a huge difference there in terms of how much cost that is to the developers and how much benefit and it can provide to the community. So typically, you can look up the details about this program if you are not familiar with it before. But typically in the United States, the income target for affordable housing is compared to AMI. So it's like whether it's affordable to 100%, 80%, or sometimes over 100%, like 120%. So that can make a difference. And if you live in one of these zones, or if you live close to one of these zones, you can probably see the effect yourself, like how much that has an effect, has an impact on the rent of your house, your apartment, or adjacent apartments. So my research mostly so far look at how inclusive zoning has worked in London. London has had a lot more, I guess, broader approach to inclusive zoning that they apply it to pretty much all the new residential constructions in the city, pretty much since early 2000s. So they have produced a large number of affordable units that way, and it has become one of the primary approaches for the city and the country really to produce new affordable housing. And I was interested in seeing how these new affordable units are placed in neighborhoods. Are they still concentrated in low-income neighborhoods, or are they more included in the more affluent and communities with better opportunities? So far what I observed was that, yes, it was efficient in terms of providing the quantity of affordable housing, but still, if you compare that to conventional social housing or public housing, there still seemed to be a trend of concentration in these newly provided affordable units. But I'm also looking, closely following how the inclusive zoning is working in Atlanta, because this is still a relatively new program, and hope to see more of units produced and see where they are. Thank you.
This microphone makes me feel like I'm Oprah or something. But I don't have anything, I don't have a car or anything to give. I can just give you synthetic a priori propositions, or something like that. All right. Oh, cool, it's moving. It took me an embarrassing long amount of time to get that to do that. All right. Anyway, all right, so you better appreciate that screen. I'm also thinking about this map where there's no lawyers, which is at once pretty awesome but terrifying at the same time. But I think I'd like to see the same one with like McKinsey management consultants, and then we can just like move them all away from where I live. Okay, so look, I'm a trained philosopher, so why, like, what does philosophy have to do with any of this? I think that one possible answer, not an answer that, it's not something that I would say. People would like to think that, oh, maybe philosophers have some sort of special insight into ethical questions or posing problems or something like that. I don't necessarily think that's true. Even empirically, some philosophers that I know are like the worst people that I've ever met in my life. So anyway, look, if we agree that the city, and we're talking about the city, and we think that the city is a site of structural forces, macro trends, and we want to know how these things affect people on the ground. These structures and these agents both enable and contradict one another. So the different parts of the city, and I have prepared remarks here, but if you don't stop me, I was told this morning I speak in paragraphs, so I'm doing my best to stick to this. But anyway, so different parts of the city, if we're talking about property taxes, MARTA, I don't know, gang members, small businesses, the city council, all of these come together in various ways to create a very specific site of capitalist social relations. In that sense, the city is a complex and variegated whole. And so we need to zoom in and out in order of these different levels of analysis. So if that's the case, my idea is that when we ask questions like, okay, like we have today. What does housing injustice look like? Well, we want to know exactly what that means, and we want to look at the structural processes that produce and reproduce injustice, and but we also need more granular vantage points from all sorts of disciplines so that we can ultimately chip away at the problem. That's the sort of impetus behind this project, as I understand it, and as a philosopher, at least I'm interested in grasping social reality. And so part of that means, I think, showing what we think is natural is not at all natural. That's actually what I think philosophy is in the business of doing. So philosophy can offer a glimpse of something that's more desirable and necessary than what already exists. In this sense, the philosopher is also working through and relating innovations that come to it from non-philosophical fields. So the interdisciplinary nature of wicked problems broadly and housing inequality more narrow would braid together all sorts of nodes that work to offset suffering and misery. Okay, so that's sort of my pitch for why philosophers, well, I will not speak for all philosophers, why this philosopher is interested in these kinds of questions, all right? So, okay, to that end, I won't speak, I can't speak for all philosophers, so I'll just continue to speak for myself. Okay, so I think that one worthwhile way of looking at fundamental philosophical problems is to see them as social contradictions abstractly conceived. These contradictions appear as practical problems without solutions, and they are often reflected in cultural dilemmas. You know, I have all these pages here, but only like 50% of them have anything to do with what I'm talking about right now. Anyway, so philosophy treats these contradictions as theoretical antinomies. In other words, insoluble conundrums that we struggle without ever reaching a convincing solution or consensus. So what am I talking about? Value and fact, for instance, freedom and necessity, individual and society, and ultimately subject and object. And so I think that we can also include wicked problems here. So this approach means that philosophical problems are significant insofar as they reflect real social contradictions. On one hand, on the other hand, philosophy can't really resolve the problems it identifies. To be blunt, I guess really only a social revolution is going to be able to do that. That's Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Oh, I forgot to change. I'm really bad with PowerPoint, so I forgot to change the slide. Like I never use it. Hence the reason it took me so long to put that together. Anyway, okay. So look. This is Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it, right? So working out of these kinds of assumptions yields a bunch of different approaches and questions, one of which has come up today: how best to offset gross inequality with regards to housing under the totalizing effects of capitalism. What does a political economy of housing look like? In what ways do housing struggles interface with class struggle? What is the role of the state with regards to housing? You know, I think philosophers always say, like, make a distinction or something like that. I guess one way to make a distinction is to do a genealogy. And so to that end, we could maybe do a genealogy of landlordism or theory of rent or something like that. That's my, my last slide. Yeah, this makes me laugh. And so, okay, how am I doing on time? Okay, let me say one more thing, and then I'll promise I'll stop talking. I'll try to stop talking. Okay, so all right. So in the past, so what am I doing thinking about this? Like, what does philosophy have to do? I've tried my best to think through this stuff in terms of egalitarianism and theories of justice. That hasn't gone so well because a lot of the debates, and there's like one person in the room who will get this, but a lot of the debates with liberal egalitarianism and political philosophy, it gets very, very technical and very, very, very boring. like Rawl. Like, I mean, if you want to fall asleep, just read Rawls for like 20 minutes. Anyway, okay, so sort of that's been one angle. Elizabeth Anderson, she's a philosopher and she has written, not extensively on housing, she wrote a book about integration. She points out that a theory of justice should bring into view the interdependency of persons through social relationships of the division of labor and the institutional rules and practices of social cooperation. So when we regard the society of a system of cooperation in which members are interdependent, then promoting justice isn't going to just like reproduce policies that reproduce the problem, right? So anyway, so let me just say one more thing. So I've been trying to draw on Jerry Cohen's work to think through this. What's important for me is that what he calls this community principle constrains this equality of opportunity principle. See, it's already getting too technical and boring, such that the latter admits too many inequalities or worse backslides into a dumb logic of personal responsibility. Like, in other words, it's your fault that you can't afford a better apartment. And in turn, this contradicts community. So in other words, I'm trying to think of this idea of community as something that like that I was going to say compromises or limits justice. Why shouldn't communities specify exactly what justice requires of us? And so that's the sort of way I've been trying to think through all of this stuff, especially like in terms of this slide. Anyway, he calls this a socialist equality of opportunity. That would require a community-friendly rather than like a market-friendly equality of opportunity. That's sort of where I'm at right now. I think that, in the 90s, there's a lot of debates in the philosophy of mind with regards to consciousness, and David Chalmers came along and wrote this book called Conscious Mind, and he said, look, we're philosophers, we should be not just kicking the can down the road and throwing up our hands and saying, oh, consciousness we need another 1,000 years. He said we need some crazy ideas to sort of like move the problem forward so we're not just like going around this silly merry-go-round. So that's sort of my thought with this stuff. Like, what can a philosophers contribute? Maybe we can contribute crazy ideas. Cards on the table, like my crazy idea is that we should just take housing off the market. Now, that sounds crazy to you, but if you sort of keep pushing towards that, maybe it'll yield significant concepts that will alter the ways in which we're thinking about housing in general. So that's what I think that philosophy can contribute, or I'm sorry, at least this philosopher can contribute. All right, I could say like a lot more, but I'm gonna stop talking now because I feel like it's been too long. Okay, I still feel like Oprah though.
I'll maybe just talk into this and turn that off for the time being. All right. Hi, everybody. Is everybody awake? Doing okay? Yeah? All right. My name is Taylor Shelton. I'm an assistant professor of geography in the Department of Geosciences here at Georgia State. And I guess I'm going to bring us home on prepared remarks by talking about the same thing everybody has, housing is a wicked problem, but specifically about what geography has to say about it. So that might not be immediately clear to any of you all, especially if you've not taken a geography course before, if your only introduction to geography as a discipline was in middle or high school or something like that, where the focus is usually on memorizing the names and locations and capitals of states and countries. How many of you, quick show of hands, how many of you have taken a geography class here at Georgia State since you've been here? Couple? I like that. Okay, good deal. Well, as those couple of folks on the back could probably tell you, right? Fundamentally, rather than being about naming, states and countries and capitals and things like that, geography as a discipline is about where. Right? It's about where questions, but it isn't about where just for the sake of where. It's because where things happen can tell us a lot about why they happen and who is most affected. And so this is especially true of housing inequality, which, like so many other things in our world, is something that we geographers call spatially uneven, which means that it doesn't occur equally in all places and at all times. And even in those places where it does occur similarly, there might be a lot of other differences, right? And the nature of the problems might be different. They might be experienced more kind of acutely by some people than by others in the same places, and so on. But by understanding where those places are and what those places have in common, what things make them different, we can help to understand what's actually kind of driving those processes. So I have worked on a number of different research projects about housing inequality in my career. I'm from Kentucky originally. I've done a bunch of projects there. I worked at Mississippi State University in rural Mississippi before I came here, and I've done housing research in all those places. But the thing I want to talk to you all about a little bit in my time up here is a very Atlanta-specific project and problem that I have started working on here in the last few years since I've been at Georgia State, which is the massive growth of corporate owned single-family rental properties. So Wall Street investment firms buying up the home next door and turning it into a rental property. So in the last decade, these kinds of Wall Street investment firms have gone from not even existing in many cases, a lot of these are companies that are brand new, to owning somewhere in the range of 400,000 single-family homes across the United States. The issues with this have been extremely thoroughly documented by journalists and scholars alike. Things like rapidly rising rents, neglecting maintenance requests, serial filing of evictions, as Dr. Pasciuti was talking about, and so on, all of which are kind of key components in driving housing instability for people today. And so at a national level, you can see here the geography of these single-family rental investments by large corporate entities across the country. These are aggregated at the scale of metropolitan statistical areas, essentially a city like Atlanta, but then also all the surrounding suburbs nearby, right? So it's not just the city of Atlanta proper, it's a little bit bigger. But one thing likely pops out at you, and that is the fact that you can hopefully see that Atlanta is the single largest center of this kind of activity in the entire country, and by a long shot, right? But you might also notice that beyond just Atlanta having the most of this thing, that there are also entire swaths of the country, especially if you look, say, in the Northeast, throughout large portions of the Midwest, that there are places where this largely is not happening at all. Now, this doesn't mean that those places don't have housing instability or inequality of some kind, but it's just suggestive of, again, the fact that something else is going on. When we don't see this in those locations, it means that something else is going to be going on there. But one of the things that unites all of these different places that show up on the map as having a lot of this kind of activity is that they're growing areas, right? They're places like Atlanta that a lot of people want to move to. They have a lot of jobs and a lot of demand for housing. But that's true of a lot of those other kinds of places I was just mentioning, right? That's true of New York City or Boston or other large metro areas around the country, but those don't show up on the map, right? So what makes places like Atlanta different? Well, with very few exceptions, the places that these companies are investing in are places where the law, again, talk about things that some of my colleagues up here have already spoken about, is places where the law is very heavily tilted in favor of landlords. There are places where few protections exist for renters, whether it be in the form of rent control laws, eviction protections, again, some of the things that have already been talked about today. But in other words, these are places where it's extremely profitable to be a landlord, both because there's high demand for the product that you have, and also that there is very little need to invest in it because the law requires so little of you. And so the potential rewards of being a landlord in these places are quite high, especially if you own so much property that then you can essentially corner the market on the housing market, right? Whether that's at the scale of an entire city or even just a neighborhood, right? It's really easy. I'm sure you all probably have some sense of this, even if you've not thought deeply about housing before, but you might know that like, oh, this house, and this house all on my street, they're all owned by the same person, right? You do that, but you expand that and scale significantly to where one company owns a much larger share of a neighborhood, right? And they can set the terms for rent or what people can expect in terms of the quality of their housing and so on, because you don't have any other choices, right? If you want to live in this neighborhood, you only got one landlord to rent from, kind of thing. So that is an important part of the picture. And so scale is another kind of important element of geography that we want to talk about, because as I forget which one of you said it earlier, but it's important to understand the ways that these problems manifest differently depending on the kind of scale at which you're analyzing the problem. So looking at Metro Atlanta here, this is some of my own work on this problem in Atlanta. In just the 5 core counties of Metro Atlanta, where just the top 10 biggest of these corporate landlords own over 32,000 single-family homes. And if you expanded this to include a little bit more of the further outlying suburban areas, that number would more than double to include over 60,000, more actually something closer to 75,000 homes, I think maybe is the number now. But you can again see, even if we're zooming into Atlanta, the place where this problem exists more than any other city or metro area in the country, right? You can see that there are places in Atlanta that have essentially none of this going on, right? But then there are also places that have a whole lot of it going on quite intensely. If I just skip forward to this map, the coloring shows the share of single-family rental properties that are owned by these 10 largest landlords. You can see if you look especially in Southern Gwinnett County, parts of South DeKalb, South Fulton, right? There are places where these 10 companies own more than half of the single-family rental properties in these small neighborhood level areas. So that question of like market power and the concentration of owners is a very important one and very much happening here in Atlanta. But the point is that because some places are so affected and other places aren't, right, that's going to very much differentiate who is affected by this problem and who isn't, right? Who experiences these problems of housing instability, particularly related to corporate landlords, and who else is going to be fairly insulated from it, maybe barely even knows that it exists. And so I'm going to leave things off here, but to say that the takeaway kind of point here is that the question of where, right, is an extremely important kind of entry point into bigger questions that we want to know about housing instability and inequality, about why the problems exist, how we might solve them, who's most affected, and what they kind of think and feel and experience when it comes to these problems. But this hopefully, if you know anything, if you've spent most of your life here in Atlanta, the patterns that you see here probably start to point you in the direction of answers to some of those questions, but all kind of coming from the perspective of where. So I'll leave it there.
All right, so I'm going to open it up to questions in a second here. I have a question to maybe start us off, and then we'll open it to y'all. Jason introduced the idea of like philosophy looks at, what is actually natural and is anything really natural? Just that so often we walk through our lives just thinking the way things are just the way things are, right? And so when we look at these wicked problems, when we look at housing, that is kind of how most people are probably going through life. Well, this is just the way it is, right? And not really thinking about how did we get here? Does it have to be that way? And so I'm wondering if a few of you want to kind of, from what you've been talking about or something else, what is something either that people think is natural or just the way things are with housing, but really are not, which is probably everything, or what are people going to be saying? Well, this is the way, so in 20 years in Gwinnett County, are most people in Gwinnett County just like, well, corporate owners of single family, like, are all the houses going to be owned by, corporations? I mean, which that's what it's kind of looking like we're heading in that direction. And so people are just going to be like, oh, okay, corporations own all the houses, the single family houses in Gwinnett County, and that's just, how it is. And I'm kind of exaggerating, but maybe that is how we function as humans, right? That it's just like, well, that's the way things are because that's the way things are. So I don't know. Anyone want to take that up?
Okay. So when I think a couple of decades from now, or even now, I don't even have to go into the future. Once again, I'm just thinking about the position of the renter, right? If that is going to become a more prevalent economic class, where we're seeing, corporate ownership and individuals renting, I would hope to see more renters understanding their role in wealth building for corporate landlords or landlords in general. When I think about complacency, I sense just an attitude sometime of almost helplessness where, for example, in a given community, the numbers are on the side of the people who rent, and they do have a stake in the quality and in, their own rights. So on a practical level, what I'd like to see is sort of a little bit more organizing of people who rent. In my own studies, I noticed that there's just a shortage of, dare I say, tenant organizations, just people. You have a community with 500 families, and they're all having the same problems and dealing with it individually. And so one of the, I guess to your point, people's mentality about, oh, that's just the way it is, people actually believe that they're on their own. Like 200 other people in this community don't have the same issue as you, and if all 200 of you, or even half, speak, the problem is, most of the time, the problem gets addressed, whatever that may be. So just seeing a little bit more solidarity there.
When I like that you've answered it, kind of flipping it around, and Jason did too, in terms of like there's hope in that too, of thinking like, okay, if we don't accept this is the way things are, they can be some other way. Yeah, yeah.
There we go. I will echo in some ways what Melody said and give a plug for if any of you have problems with your landlord, if any of you like the idea of organizing your neighbors in your apartment building or something like that, if there exist organizations like Housing Justice League here in Atlanta that are focused on kind of doing that work, but and would love to have you all be part of the organization. One additional thing I would say that is a kind of natural notion that is something to break apart, and I feel emboldened by my fellow panelists and the things that they were saying, is right that landlords often like to think of themselves, or it's becoming an interesting trend now that landlords don't want to be called landlords because they think it's become like a slur, right? It's a pejorative term to call somebody a landlord, right? It's got this like feudal connotation, right? They instead want to be called housing providers, right? But landlords don't provide housing, right? Landlords hoard housing and charge you money for the ability to live in something that you should have a right to, right? So the idea, again, that we're just kind of picking away at the logic that the market or the capitalist society that we find ourselves living in is the only way to organize the use of something as crucial and important as housing, right? It does not have to be this way, right? It is this way for a variety of reasons, but it does not have to be. There are alternatives. They just are maybe not always ones that are the easiest or most palatable to the people who get to make decisions in our lives, things like that. So.
When I like that you bring in a language example, like I'm literature and language, and so it's like, yeah, that is how reality gets shaped, right? Is like, no, let's change the word here, and I'm a housing provider, not a landlord, and that has, if people accept that, then they accept a reality in a way. So.
I guess what I can add to that is just sort of extend the conversation with my colleagues here is that even just beyond renters and just thinking about the capacity of persons who live in the city to affect change, we think of politics and we spend a lot of time and energy thinking about national elections and state elections, right? Who's going to be in the Gold Dome, in the next election type thing. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about local level issues and questions and organizational units. And what I mean by that is there are all sorts of small scale political entities within the city, the neighborhood planning units that exist all across Atlanta as an example, as well as other forms of sort of decentralized governance within the urban space. And you have a right as an individual to go be in those spaces, to vote in those spaces, to put yourself or someone else into a position of power in those spaces, and we don't utilize them. I mean, institutions, organizations within the city have elections, and I can tell you from experience of being at ones where the new CEO of some particular community district is elected with 14 votes. It's a district that has like 150,000 people living in it, and 14 people came out and made the decision about who the next leader of that organization was going to be. 13 people voted for the person who was going to be president, and one person abstained and said, there's no other options, but I don't want this. That was what decided an organization, a community organization that has a multi-million-dollar budget and helps decide and heavily influences questions of zoning, questions of planning, all sorts of local level issues within the neighborhood about what is going to get built, where it's going to get built. And so, we don't need to necessarily worry. I'm not saying don't worry about who the next mayor of Atlanta is going to be or who the next governor of Georgia is going to be. All right? I'm not saying not to do that. All I'm saying is you could have a very direct effect right now of just showing up to your local NPU and voting in the next election about literally who is going to be sitting on that board, who is going to have effects in housing policy and zoning strategy, in what is the conversation even around something like housing, especially in something around housing.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, just to add my a bit more foreign perspective here. So that when I heard that question, it kind of just brought me back to some remote memory. I'm from China and grew up, I guess, sort of still kind of in the stage of rapid changes in China, both socially and economically. So what I recall from my childhood, from my parents' generation, and probably their parents for some decades, housing used to not be an issue in China at all. Because when you have a job, typically, if you're an urban resident, rural residents is a different story, but when you have a job, you get housing. That's just the part of the benefits that you're entitled to. But then, so that was what was considered natural at the time. That people didn't have to worry about rent or anything, but suddenly things changed, right? And then what followed that was maybe 30 years of very fast growth. And just like I mentioned, urbanization and economic growth and also population growth in these major cities that comes with fast appreciation of homes in those places. So I remember when I was in college, we did some kind of field study. I went to college in Beijing, like the capital of China. We did some field study, like we surveyed some like neighborhoods around the school and including some projects being in construction. We saw like how the price at which they were being sold. And we found that absurd. But you know what happened like now, like 10 years later, that price was still absurd, like absurdly low compared to what it is today. So then what was natural to us, like to our generation, was this like constant growing home prices and home like housing costs. So rent is a bit lag behind, but still it kind of grows a bit slower than prices for sale. But now what seems to be natural for us is also about to change because China is facing potentially, probably housing market stagnation, at least, if not a collapse. So just want to put it out there that things can and do change, although not necessarily in the good direction. But it just shows that there are these different scenarios, different possibilities for a housing market as well, even if it might seem like remote possibilities right now.
Okay, do we want to, Jason, do you have something to say? Your philosophy drove that, so you don't have to respond, but, or we can open it up however you want to do it.
No, I would just say first that I think that landlords should get an actual job. But no, I think there's two things that I would say. One is that I think that a lot of stuff is driven by a failure of imagination, and that we do just take like the idea that like, well, housing is a market and that's how markets work, and tough luck, and that there is something else possible, whether or not, and we just have to sort of keep pushing in a way towards that end. I think a lot of trying to think of his name. Robin D.J. Kelley said something to the effect, and I only knew him as a biographer of Thelonious Monk. I had like no other idea that he wrote all this other stuff. And so I started reading some of this stuff, and he said something to the effect that like, we always talk about social movements in terms of their failure, right? Oh, this didn't work, this won't work, this can't work. Instead of thinking about was the vision itself worthwhile, right? And so I think that's a kind of way that I come to these issues with, personally.
Okay, so do we have some questions from the audience? Can you step up to the microphone so we can get I know we could probably hear you, but the film won't hear you if we don't have you on the, and I think that works, I'm not sure.
So when we talk about housing and historically among African Americans with different situations happening from the government, like redlining and the denial of home loans for African Americans, how much does that play in part, especially from your standpoint of large corporations kind of buying up areas that are predominantly African American because they can't, afford, or they can't be able to obtain a loan to buy homes in those areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. For those of you who are not aware of some of the terms that you just used, right? Redlining is this historical process initiated by banks and lending institutions and supported by the federal government in the 1930s in the U.S. that was by and large extremely racially discriminatory and served as one of the kind of key things shaping the housing market that we have today. While in many cases the actual kind of official version of redlining is a little bit beside the point of some of these corporate landlords, largely because a lot of these places that we're talking about, that Brennan, if you flip back one slide or so, right? A lot of these places where a lot of that's happening, right? These are places that were not actually substantially inhabited, almost a century ago, right? These were actually still very rural places, and so the kind of redlining element was not developed there at that time, but the same logic is the thing that drives a lot of the kind of general financing of home loans and things like that that you saw prior to the foreclosure crisis and in the early part of the 21st century, when I'm sure so many of you were like maybe barely alive or definitely not even sentient, fully thinking human beings quite yet. But those same kind of logics, so like predatory lending was the logic that we used. So it's almost like it was reverse redlining, right? We're actually going to incorporate Black folks or other people of color more significantly into the financial system through giving them loans, but we're going to give them on terms that actually set them up to fail, right? And that actually then becomes the primary progenitor of these corporate single-family landlords in suburban US, and especially places like Atlanta. So Atlanta, Phoenix, Tampa, these are kind of the biggest places where these, if you went back to the national level map where that's happening, and that's because those are places where predatory lending, subprime lending was happening the most intensely. Here in Atlanta, right, it was primarily to Black folks, but in places like in Phoenix, it was largely to Latino families and stuff, right? So the very racial character and of both the people and of the places is absolutely part of why this is happening there, right? And if you go back one or go forward one more, right? The place that has none of this, right? What's the thing in Atlanta that makes all of those places where we've got the nice like little donut hole in the middle, right? Say it. A little further north, what are the neighborhoods?
Who lives there?
And a lot of people just like him, right? Rich white folks mostly, right? This is not a problem in places where rich white folks live, right? But it's a problem for everybody else, and especially low, moderate income, Black, Latinx, to some extent Asian American, homeowners and renters in the suburbs of Atlanta.
Just to add to that, very much on that point, right? That idea of resources, right? And this is where we extend this idea of housing insecurity into all these other ways that it resonates in other forms of the ability to, rely on resources, right? And not so much in the problem of Atlanta, but the question back to like the presence of lawyers. The even being, is there a lawyer there you can even find to ask the question? But in terms of how communities can respond, the knowledge, and I'm so not even just talking, obviously financial is incredibly important here, but just the knowledge, right? Do you know who your NPU unit is? Do you know who your city councilman is, or who these things and these responses come to play in this, and a variety of sort of health and other factors that play into that dynamic.
Okay, so I know some people might have time limits, so certainly if you need to go, you can go. But we can, or those of us who can stay, can continue to talk for a bit. So if people have questions, walk up to the mic that doesn't work, and we'll bring you a mic that does work. Any more questions?
Seen a lot of those crazy places, know a lot of people that live in those places. So I'm just to encourage anybody who's having seen or to take a look at
The dangerous dwellings list or series of articles. Yeah, very, very good recommendation for anybody who's interested in places to avoid if you have any ability to, but
So, yeah, I mean, that series literally drove that entire presentation that I gave. That my presentation was based on. That came up for me because of dangerous dwellings, which was, holy cow, we got to start thinking about maintenance, right? The slums of tomorrow are being built today. 20, future dangerous dwellings are being built now. And so without proper standards and guidelines as it relates to a variety of variables, including indoor air quality, we run the risk of just continuing that cycle. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, that was a great series.
And someone who knows more about evictions than me is, my understanding is that like, because of evictions and how people get evicted over and over and over again, that you have some of these places that are horrible places to live, but they might cost the same amount of money as nicer places, but someone who has an eviction on their record can only live in those places. So living in some of those places, you might be paying as much as a much nicer apartment. And that's me just talking, so someone who knows.
I mean, what I'd say is that you don't even need the eviction on your record. The irony of how things work in Atlanta is that even the filing is something that is scraped off the servers, and there are databases maintained by management companies and landlords, so that even the filing itself becomes something that affects your record. So you don't actually even have to be evicted, you just have to be filed against by your landlord, and it's already gonna raise a flag within the system the next time you go to apply for a place to live. And to Brennan's point, there's very clear literature that shows, right, once that process starts down, you sort of start on this spiral downward of what housing is available to you. And Taylor can speak very clearly to that then when you start connect that into the presence of corporate landlords that control large-scale housing, and they're all using the same management company, and they're all using the same database of who's applying to where and what red flags that you play, your ability to have any choice in housing becomes very narrow very quickly in these processes.
I just want a quick personal story, because just to bring that idea full circle, I moved here about 7 years ago. I live apartment community right up there in North Fulton. And the apartment community, so imagine I'm in a two bedroom, 2 bath, no washing machine. And my water bill is maybe around $200 a month. Now, I'm in North Fulton, so there are neighborhoods near mine with 5 bedroom, 4 baths, water bill, $70, all right? My neighbor's water bill's super high. Something weird is going on. And so, to the point we were all kind of making, I personally decided, okay, we're gonna start organizing. I'm gonna get with some of my neighbors, we're gonna figure this out. And so we got to a point where I was being extremely effective. And on a Saturday, I received a notice that my lease was being terminated. And if I don't move in 2 weeks, I will have an eviction filed. Now, to your point, I knew at that time that just having the filing ruined my ability to move myself and my daughter to anywhere that is livable. It is over for me to be able to, just the filing alone. So then what do you do? Luckily, the year before, our General Assembly passed a bill, believe it or not, that protected tenants from retaliation. And so because I knew the law, the retaliation law, I was able to leverage that to negotiate things. But still, the point is, that is used so often as a tool of retaliation. And it does kind of go against a lot of the, organizing and things and advocacy that can happen. So, sorry.
No, that's a great example.
Just to add, to take it out of the context specifically of Atlanta, there's an interesting dynamic of how that plays out, which is that in Georgia, how courts keep records varies greatly. And I promise you, I've seen them. There are courts in this state. If you go in and you say, I would like to see the records, there's a tiny little room in the back that literally has shoe boxes. And all the records are there in little packets stapled together. And that is the only form they exist in. They only exist on paper in that room, in that box. So the threat of an eviction filing, even an eviction, actually has, to some extent, well, let me put it this way. It has significantly less power in the context of some place like that than it does in the Atlanta Metro. And the core Atlanta Metro, all the courts have digital record systems that are scrapable and accessible. And so there's an interesting irony that not living in Atlanta, you actually have more protections within the courts about access to your information, because it would require a management company or a landlord specifically going to that court and saying, I want a copy of this record. Whereas in Atlanta, they don't actually have to do it because it's literally digitally available public, right? And there's an irony in sociology. It's called the advantages of backwardness. That actually being backwards has an advantage when you're not in Atlanta. That Atlanta trying to be on the cusp and being digital and being modern actually creates negative consequences for a lot of people.
All right. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming out, and thank you all for speaking.